Good afternoon, everybody. This is Gary from Vigilant Software. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon, where we're going to be covering off a training webinar for the data flow mapping tool. For some of you that have already taken part in previous webinars and also demonstrations, a lot of the this afternoon's presentation is going to involve some of those. However, we're going to go a little bit more into detail when it comes to the usability of the product, as well as some new areas that we've added to the product over the past couple of weeks. So we're just going to run through some slides just to give you an introduction as to what we're going to be covering today. And then obviously we're going to move into the using the product itself. And then, as I mentioned, going through some new additional Article 30 parts that we've added onto the data mapping tool as well. So today's discussion, we're going to be running through an introduction. We're then going to show you how to access the tool and then subsequently the user management off the back of that. We're then going to go through an in-depth process mapping exercise, and that's actually going to be using the tool from my side here. The final outcome, which is ultimately going to be the report that we're going to be able to produce, and then finally towards the end, a Q&A. Now, with the webinar being a mute to all attendees, there is a message or chat box that you should be able to populate as we're going through the webinar this afternoon, and we'll go through those in the last 15 minutes of the presentation. Anything we don't answer or are unable to answer this afternoon, we'll come back to you via email directly, just to ensure that you do get the answers you're looking for. So an introduction to the data flow mapping tool, or more of a definition of what a data flow map is. It's a diagram of how personal data flows throughout a given process and transferred from asset to asset. The data flow mapping tool, in essence, is designed to simplify the process of creating data flow maps, which will then help you meet the terms of the EU General Data Protection Regulation, more commonly known as the EU GDPR. Organisations should already be looking to create data flow maps of all their existing processes ahead of GDPR compliance deadline. Obviously, we've now gone past there, but it is still key that you do illustrate these process maps and how you handle data within your business moving forward. CyberComply is an online cyber security and compliance platform. It hosts a number of integrated tools, mainly from Vigilant Software, being the inclusion of the Compliance Manager, which is an area where it stores all of the EU GDPR, as well as some other UK laws, some ISO controls as well, where you'll be able to mark your compliancy or whether you're integrating them. And then obviously the presentation that we're focusing on today is going to be the data flow mapping tool side of that portal. So in order to create an accurate data flow map of each process, you will need to know the following three things: what every step of the process is. So you may need to hold some stakeholder meetings within your business just to get a clearer understanding as to what data you're dealing with, where it's being handled, what assets are involved. You'll then need to figure out who carries out each step, and then finally what assets are used to do so. So you'll need to know the controllers of information, who the processors of that information are if you're going to be acting as, or if you are employing a third party to handle your data. And then obviously the last point, what assets are used to do so, be that servers, be that particular departments or people within your organization. So using the tool, this is just a quick slide we're going to run through just to go through some of the key points for the data flow mapping tool for either new users or existing users, and then obviously we'll move on to actually creating a process map to start with. So we've gone through some main points that we wanted the data flow map to offer. So the first one is it has to be easy to use. With the deadline obviously being a couple of weeks ago, there was a bit of a rush to get people compliant, so we had to make it easy, simple, and ready to use straight off the bat. So it gives you more time to start identifying and resolving data protection issues within your own company. It's geared for repeatability, so the data flow maps created within the tool can be easily reviewed, edited, updated by multiple people as your organization evolves and grows. This is through the option of having more than one user simultaneously accessing, and also dynamically changing who has access to the portal as well. It does log personal data items, so it will generate an inventory of personal data, specifying what the lawful basis is and the types of personal data and the categories of the data subjects as well. As we mentioned at the beginning, the tool itself can generate data flow reports. There's two of them that are built into the data mapping tool. One is solely focused at a process level, so illustrating what assets are involved from a top level. And then once we go into the data flow map, there's a more in-depth explanation as to what data items you're going to be handling, the subject, records, and so on. So a version controlled data flow report compiles information from your data flow map in an easy to read format. to share with stakeholders. It embeds data protection by design. We've had consultants and legal bodies help us build this software to ensure that everything you're compiling is going to be up to date based on the EU GDPR regulation requirements. So our tool is essential for organisations seeking to embed data protection by design and by default in their processes. It then also gives optional access to security controls. This is something I briefly touched on a moment ago. The data flow mapping tool integrates with our compliance manager. This is where you can record what security controls have been applied to a process and keep track of whether the process is governed by specific regulatory, statutory and contractual requirements as well. So user management. We're going to run through these, then we're going to go into the tool itself. So how many can you have? As I mentioned a moment ago, you can have up to 5 users as standard. However, as your business may evolve, grow and expand, you can purchase additional blocks of 5 to suit your individual business needs. Archiving users will simply make that person a dormant user of the tool, therefore relinquishing their access to the portal, and therefore you can then administer or distribute that to another business or person within your company. So you can always expand the note, but if you're happy just to dynamically change who has access at any given point, you can do that within the account settings as well. So setup, we're going to go through into our Cyber Comply screen now. So if we just give this a second to switch over. So as some of you may already be aware, the tool itself is completely cloud-based. It's all accessed via a web browser, which we do recommend you use either Google Chrome, Microsoft Edge or Mozilla Firefox. Some of the older browsers do have some UI issues that we are aware of, but unfortunately we're unable to mitigate to certain extents. As I mentioned, is completely hosted through a cloud solution. We do have in-depth security notices that we're more than happy to share with you after the demonstration. They can also be accessed through our website, and obviously for people that have been on previous demonstrations, that follow-up email would have also been sent just showing what type of accreditations we have as a business, where we store your data and how long we store that information for on your behalf. So once we've logged on to the Cyber Comply portal, you'll be greeted by the Welcome to Cyber Comply screen that you can see at the moment. On the left-hand side is our Compliance Manager. That isn't going to be a focus point for this afternoon's webinar, but essentially that is where the aforementioned information such as the EU GDPR regulations, ISO 27001 controls are all hosted, and over time that will be built upon, but only obviously dependent on demand by our customer base. Over on the right-hand side is the data flow map icon, which is where we're going to be going to in just a second, and then below there's a quick start guide. So if these webinars aren't convenient to yourselves when you are going to be introducing new users to the tool itself, we do have in-depth manuals, quick start guides just to get them up to speed, to help them obviously introduce them to the tool itself, and obviously they can almost learn as they go through as well. At the top right hand corner we have a request assistance button that's dedicated, so that will simply come through to our support team here. We have an experienced team that have been using the tool for many months. We are also backed very closely by the developers of the product as well. So if you have any feedback you may wish to pass on to them, we're more than happy to do that for you. Or if there's any questions you may have regarding the technical use of the product, we will always come back to you as well. It's an unlimited support structure, so there's no limit to the amount of times you can get in touch with us. You're not restricted to one a day, once a week, so on and so forth. And we'll always endeavour to come back to you within a 24-hour period during a normal working week. Over on the right hand side below there, you'll have again an area where you can request assistance. You'll have your user details. Now I'm not going to go into this one because it does contain some of my own information, but this is an area where you will be able to go through. You can modify things like your own phone number, your email address, name, etc., or even organization details. The next section below there is your account summary. So in the account summary, as most of the people on this webinar do already have access to it, so if you're doing this as we're going through the webinar, by clicking on here, you'll be able to see on the top left-hand side your business information, such as the address, number of employees, turnover, etc. Over on the right-hand side, will show your current subscriptions, so whether you have the Compliance Manager and the Data Mapping tool, or just one or the other, as well as when they are due to expire. And then over on the far left hand side, just below your business information, you'll have user details or users. Next to there's a plus icon, and then that's where the organization administrator, be that yourself or somebody else in the business, will have the opportunity to add somebody else to the portal, and equally you should be able to remove them. If you do have difficulty doing that, contact us through the request assistance and we can automatically remove them straight away for you. That's not a problem. So the next section that you'll come to will then be under settings. This is an area we're going to have a look at purely because it does have an impact on how you're going to be mapping processes further on down the line. So the first tab you'll come to for users that have been able to access the data flow map for a while now, this area has been slightly tidied up in the fact you'll now have tabs on the left-hand side. So the first tab you'll come to will be classifications. The top four are what you'll receive as standards. You'll have confidential, private, public, and restricted. You can toggle these on and off given depending on who has access to the tool. If you know you're not actually going to be publicly making any of your data available, or if you don't want to use it as restricted, you can toggle them on and off or simply delete them. And then below there you have the ability to add on new classifications like we have at the bottom, such as sensitive and highly restrictive. These are freehand text, so it's entirely up to yourself what you want to have listed in there. We just chose some more commonly used classification types. Now, if you have started to use some of these classifications in your process records, records that have been stored on assets, you won't be able to remove them unless you start removing information from your process maps as well. The next tab down will be custom regions. Now, we've just put a couple of placeholders in here just to populate the screen. The one that we've used at the top here is, for example, we know exactly where our data is stored in the cloud. So we know it's going to be our Microsoft Azure data center based in Ireland. So we've just made that available to us. So when we create new assets, we can show that they're located in that particular region. Below there, you then have the one that we've got listed, which is Kansas. So we've just gone through into more of a deep dive as to maybe you're a US-based company and you want to specify exactly where in your country or what state that data is going to be stored in, as opposed to just using the big umbrella use of United States of America. And next to each one, you'll also see a status as to whether it's EEA or non-EEA. Below there, you'll then have the contact details for processing records. So at the top here, we've just got a very basic one, Vigilant Demo, which is my portal. You'll then be able to put in your business address and then obviously use this registered address as a contact address. Below there, if you have a data protection officer, that will all need to be put in here, or also commonly known as a compliance manager as well within some businesses. If you do outsource this position to another company, you will still need to have that information available to you for obviously when you create these reports, run the reports from the tool itself, and obviously if you are then asked to submit these to maybe an ICO, that information is going to need to remain being updated. Then below there you can add in representatives, so who's going to be representing your business on the grander scheme of things. So we're now going to return back to our dashboard, and we can do so at the top left-hand corner, and we're going to jump into our data flow mapping tool. So to some people that have already gone through our demonstrations, some of this is going to look very reminiscent. Essentially, it is just meant to give you a key indicator as to what areas or what certain areas of the tool you can modify, parts you can compile to your own requirements and specifications, and areas where you can then change lawful basis and the types of data items you're going to be dealing with. So at the top here, on this drop down at the left-hand side, the two areas that you'll have access to with the data flow mapping tool will be organization assets, and then the highlighted one at the bottom, which is organization processes. These middle ones here are mainly focused purely for the compliance manager, and that's where you're going to be able to go through, view more in-depth information such as requirements and implementation guidance, and then finally a type of a tick list, for better words, which will give you a way of reporting whether you're compliant, non-compliant, and whether it's been implemented or not. So the first area we're going to have a look at today is going to be our organization assets. Now, we do already have a pre-compiled list on here on the left-hand side. So we've got our sales websites and so on. Essentially, these are the assets that we commonly use when we do these demonstrations. At the top here, we can search. Obviously, over time, your asset library may become quite comprehensive. It'll be easier to quick search as opposed to scrolling. The next one along here will then be able to outline which ones are seen as controllers within our business or controllers of the data, and which ones are seen as third parties. There's a drop-down box here which will just give you a help or tip or insight into the area that you're currently working on. And if you want to select all of your assets and run either subsequent reports based on the back of that, or alternatively just work on them in bulk if you need to make a modification to maybe locations to all of them, it might be easier just to select all and go through them one by one like so. Below there, you'll then have the option to create a new asset. So these are the requirement boxes you're going to have to fill in to start off with. So the first one is going to be the asset type. So this is going to be whether the asset's seen as a mobile phone, so mobile device, mobile application, a sub-process, warehouse, or simply by selecting other at the bottom here, you can then stipulate what other is going to be seen as within your business. The next one down on here is going to be the reference. That's what you're going to be calling it. So you can see on the left-hand side, we've chosen to put in things like company sales website, billing team, distributor, company servers, etc. You'll then need to outline who the operator that's going to be. So I've just chosen Vigilant Demo Gary, and that's essentially the portal that I'm accessing. But this would also be an area where you choose controller, joint controller, processor, etc. Finally, at the bottom there, you'll then have your locations to where the asset is going to be based or where it is based within your company. So at the top, you'll notice that these aren't necessarily in alphabetical order, and that's purely because the system will automatically bump the more commonly used locations that you use in all of your assets and processes towards the very top, again, to help with that repeatability and speed when you're trying to create this from the ground up to start with. Next to each one of these countries, again, you'll have its status, whether it's EEA, non-EEA, or whether there's been an EC adequacy decision made. Once you've selected all that, we won't save it for now, you'll end up with a finished product that looks very similar like this, which then can be used within any of your process maps, modified at a later point if needs be, and any changes that you do make. They're global changes, therefore it'll have an impact across all your processes, again, saving you time having to go back through and make those modifications. Before we go through the asset level, as we can see on the screen, there's one other area on here that may be of benefit to a lot of people moving from older systems. So if you do already have a pre-existing asset register, that can be imported in bulk using an Excel document. Alternatively, if you want to start an asset register outside of the system, simply download our Excel template, populate it with the relevant information, obviously matching what the system would ordinarily be requiring of you, and then you can import it in bulk, and you then also got a offline copy if you needed to for later dates as well. So we'll cancel out of here. So now that we've got our asset at the top here, again, we can see its asset type. So at that point, we'd chosen it to be a web application. We can see if there's any records that are being stored on this particular asset, what the operator is or what it's seen to be within our business, and then finally its location. So we've got our set to be United Kingdom. As you saw in the location drop down, you can also input your own custom locations if you'd already done that at the very beginning as well. So below each one of these, this is an area that isn't mandatory. You don't have to fill this information in, but some people do find it helpful to keep records for when you're running reports. You can show this maybe to an external source if they wish to see this, or even just for your own internal records as well. So if you are a company that is already ISO 27001 accredited or certified, sorry, you can then show that, yes, we are using these particular controls in conjunction with this particular asset. This might be more the case when it comes to company servers and things like that, but this is more of just a placeholder for the time being. So by selecting on add control, we can either remove a control from the asset that we're already using, or we can add on a multitude of different ones if we needed to. So you're not just stuck to one at a time and therefore having to duplicate work over and over again. Next to each one of these, you'll have an I button. By selecting on the I button, it gives you a description as to what that particular control is. Now, if you do have access to the compliance manager as well as part of the bundle package, you will not only be able to see the description and its reference as to which annex it falls under and its status. Over here, you'll be able to mark straight away whether you are, whether it's selected and planned for implementation, or whether it's selected, implemented, excluded, or not considered for now. If you don't have the compliance manager, this option won't be available to you, and you'll only be able to see the description of what that control actually is. Again, with the compliance manager, sorry, I just missed that off. If you select open on here, it takes you to the other side of the portal where you can view, as I mentioned earlier, the full requirement of that control and also implementation guidance. So we'll cancel out this section. The next area that we're going to come to is then going to be the related legal requirements. Again, not a mandatory section, but it is somewhere that you can use to keep track of things as you progress through GDPR. So if we select on add requirement, it's going to work in exactly the same way as the control sets did. So under here, the first section you'll come to will be UK laws. The reason for that is essentially what this is what the compliance manager was originally built around. And then if we scroll, I believe it's about midway down, we can also use the filter if needs be. We'll just scroll down, and then you'll come into the EU GDPR, where it'll be broken down into its individual articles and recitals as well. Again, selecting on the I button, you'll get the description of what that particular regulation is. As you can see, we do also have the Compliance Manager bundled with ours, so we can see that we are already now compliant with this, and we can also go back in, select open, and again, you'll have access to those requirements and also implementation guidance as well. So we'll close out of here and close. The next tab along here is related to tasks. This isn't necessarily something you're going to be using within assets. It's just a tab that is going to be available to you in multiple areas of the tool. And you'll notice that these tabs along the bottom here will all have the same headers, but they may act ever so slightly differently when you're in different aspects of the product. The next one along is going to be related processes. Now, in this section in assets, the way that related processes is illustrated is by saying that this particular asset is being used in these processes, not that you've manually chosen a process to show a relationship with. It's one that is currently being used within. The next tab along is going to be a message board come audit trail. So very much like some of you may have seen that you can do when you're in the process section. It's exactly the same in here. So you can go through, you can see if there's been any requirement changes to it, if there's been any control modifications. It keeps track of exactly who has made that change. So we can see here, Gary Baxter added a 5.1.1 25 days ago to this particular asset. We'd also be able to see if it was ever put into a draft state or a published state, and we'll come into that in a bit more detail as we go through as well. There is also, as you've seen over on the right-hand side, an area where you can leave a comment or messages to each other, and they do just show very much like a form thread would do below in the message section. So if you just want to keep notes or leave notes to each other as you're going through and working on either assets or process simultaneously, it's a nice way to keep track of what's going on. There is also an area to upload any file type here. Essentially, it's just a storage area, so providing that you have the appropriate software your side once it's downloaded, you can then view it as it originally was uploaded as well. There are additional editing options here along the top here, so you've got your standard bold, italic, underline, etc. But then you've also got the ability to add in neat and tidy hyperlinks if you wanted to tidy things up as well. So we will come out of this section. Click cancel. And then lastly on here, if we do want to show a relationship between particular assets, we can do so. Again, not a mandatory field. It's not something that auto-populates itself either. It is something you would need to do yourself if you choose to. And exactly the same way as the regulations and controls work, select associate asset, and then you can choose from any of your other assets that you've created within your own data flow mapping tool portal. At the top here, we have some additional options. We can simply delete the asset. Now, by doing this, it won't let you do it if it is currently being used within a process map. So you would need to actually go through and remove it from those processes before you can delete it globally across the entire platform. The next option on here is if you need to edit an asset. It is quite common that these things can change over time, so it's not set in stone once you have created it. But again, please note any modification you make in this section is global. So if we were to change the name on this now and then select save or publish in this case, it would then have a global effect across the rest of your processes, and then also make it available based on the new information in your asset library moving forward. If you are working on a large group of them at any given point, you could just choose to close all of them out of this middle section here, just so you can focus mainly on the one that we've got up on the screen at the moment. And then finally, by selecting the cross button, it just pops it back into the left-hand side column where you'll have a list of your overall assets as well. So that is the organization assets. It is a relatively new area, so it is something we try to cover off during these webinars. If you're one of the early adopters to the product itself, you would have noticed that the only way you used to be able to add an asset was within the process map, but that feature is still there, and we will cover it off as we get progress into that section as well. So we're now going to go into the organization process section of the data mapping tool. We are going to be running through one that's been pre-configured. We are, however, going to be covering off what information you need to populate before creating a process, what information you need to know before creating that, and then finally ending up inside that process map, going through how we built it, what information we're dealing with, and then ultimately the report towards the end, and then covering off the questions. So at the top here, again, you can quickly search through your processes. Now, the not started and started statuses, this is purely in the fact that if you are creating a process and you leave it in a draft state, you can log out of the system. It will store that information, but it will just keep it as a draft visible only to yourself, not to any of the other users. So if you want to quickly run through, say you've got 50 process maps and you need to quickly know from the top level, oh, hang on, I'm sure I've not done one or two of them, you can quickly search that way. Alternatively, it's just a nice way to quickly search through processes if you're in maybe a meeting or need to run a new report. The next tab along on here is going to be a very top level pie chart view, and it just gives you an indication as to the number of processes you have that you are seen to be a controller of, processor within, or a third party in. The next button on here is again that bulb icon. It just gives you help and tips, and then when we go into the process map itself, it allows the user to download our comprehensive, full detailed manual as well. Finally, on here on the left hand, on the far right hand side, you can choose to select all. That will then populate every single process regardless of the group it's stored within, and then you can run a report across all of them without having to open up each process each time and running its own report separately. So below there, now that we've just covered off these main points at the top, we're going to go through and create a new process. Well, when I say create a new one, we're just going to create a test one for now, and then we're going to go back to one that we made earlier just to keep things nicely running along. So as you've seen here, it's asked us to automatically go into an edit mode. Now what edit mode does, and I've briefly touched on this a second ago, is it puts the user requesting to create a new process map into a draft state. So if you've got 4, maybe 9, 10, 20 other people currently logged into the portal at that point, they're not going to be able to see anything you're completing until you're happy with your work, and then you're going to publish it. So we're going to select yes to switch. And it's going to bring you into this area. So to create a new process, first select an existing group or create a new group. If you've already been using the tool and this is just more of a refresher, obviously you'd see from this drop down you can choose from your own process groups that you may have already previously created. If you're brand new to using the portal, we can simply select on create a new group. You'll be asked to give that group a name, subtitle and description. This can be as in-depth or as brief as you want it to be. And we normally find most businesses will separate this based on either a department, be that sales, human resources, customer service, etc., as just a few basic examples. Alternatively, it could be even a larger area of the business, maybe a subsidiary if you're a larger global group. So we're just going to choose processes and hit select. Now, for people that have had the tool for a while, this area will be new to you, and we're just going to cover off the information you need to be populated in here to ensure that you are complying correctly with the GDPR. So at the top here, you'll need to give obviously your process its title. So what is the process within your business? Fine. Next after that, you'll need to be outlining who the process owner of that is within your company, and what they're going to be seen to be acting as. Now, depending on what you choose from this drop down, will then decide which one of these boxes will then be shown. They're all going to be shown as a default automatically, and as I mentioned, if you chose something like controller, this wouldn't show on there, and if you have something like a joint controller, that also wouldn't show either. So below there, you'll then have the controller's contact details. So just to run through some of these areas, so support for Article 30 records of processing provides users with the ability to set contact details for the organisation and its data protection officer and or representative where applicable, which are these two boxes here, and they will need to be populated. The next one would be to provide the controller's contact details for processes where the organisation is not the controller in a particular case. And then finally, to specify technical and organisational security measures for every process. So those are the new areas that we've added in for the people that have had the tool for a while now. So you'll have the controller's contact details, additional representatives here, and then finally the scope and purpose have remained the same, but you may want to just outline if there's any technical or organisational security measures. So for example, in our case, we might have PCI DSS as an implemented control when it comes to dealing with either credit card payments online and so on. So providing we had populated all that information in there, we're going to select one that we've created before. So this is the software sales within the EEA. So at the top here, you'll be able to see the title, who the owner of the process is, and then finally just a scope statement along the top here. Now, if we were still in that draft state, what you'd see at the top is a orange flag in the top left-hand corner. It would also be illustrated over here if the group itself or the process group itself was also brand new as well. Before you were to proceed any further, you'd need to come to the top here, and then you choose to publish changes, and then that would make the overall process available to everybody else. So below there, we've got these same tabs. So if you want to put a very broad statement that we are using this control at some point in our process, you can do that. Like I mentioned earlier, these aren't mandatory fields. You don't have to populate these areas if you don't need to at the very beginning. Just get the process maps to create, start with, and then obviously go through and start fine-tuning this information if you wanted to later on. The next one, as we went through earlier, is that related legal requirements. We've then got the related tasks. So you may have somebody that's going to go through and create the top level process, and then go into maybe a stakeholder meeting with that particular team and that department head and say, look, this is the process map you need to do. I'm going to assign you a task within the product itself and grant you access, and then they can mark whether that task has been completed further on down the line as well. The next option on here is related processes. So different to the way that the organization assets illustrates this information, this is a manual choice. So this won't pick up on another process within your business that it has figured out has a relationship. It's something that you can just mark on here. Again, not mandatory. It's not a way to overlap process maps necessarily, but you may want to show that maybe the pre-sales process has then got a relationship with the post-sales, etc. And obviously there are more in-depth examples if needs be. The next tab on here is again that same message board. This one's a bit more detailed, as we have been playing around with this earlier on today as well, just to ensure that we had the correct contact details and everything all updated on here. Again, we've got that same comment section. Now on here, related assets, this is something that will mirror the organization assets. So this is kind of the flip side of the coin. So any asset that you're currently using in that process map will automatically populate itself underneath here. At the top right-hand corner, we have the option to clone a process. This will create a copy of the one that you're looking at right now. That would include the process map itself, as well as just everything you can see on screen. And it's quite handy if you're just wanting to replicate an entire process, but there might be a small change in maybe one piece of data item you're handling differently, or if maybe an asset or maybe a customer is located in a different area. The next tab along on here is the ability to edit a process. So very similar in the way the organization assets work. These aren't set in stone. You can always go back in and modify these if you need to. You can delete a process. Now you are given 2 warnings before doing so. If you do delete it, unfortunately, it has been lost forever. So please be very careful when choosing this option, but you are always given a 2-box prompt to ensure that you are wanting to delete that requirement. Again, the last section on here is the close button, and that just minimizes it back into its group. Now, before, if you can imagine we were still in that draft state, we hadn't published any of our changes, you won't be able to create a data flow map. So if you're trying to do this and follow along on your screen as well, and you're still in that draft state, the data flow map icon will still be grayed out. You can't create a map until you've published these changes. Again, if you're happy with everything you've created at that point, you simply navigate to the top right-hand corner under the spanner icon and choose Publish Changes, and it'll ask you to leave a note in there as to what changes have been made. Now, the last section we're going to go through before going into the data flow map is the report that at this level we can run. So if we select on Run the Report, it will load it inside the portal itself. We can choose to print directly from the browser, or alternatively, as some of you are probably aware, within a browser you can also choose to export into PDF as well. So this is just going to go through, give you the issue date when that report was produced. So it's a way of keeping a track and obviously your journey as you're going through GDPR. You'll then be able to see the owner of the process, what they're acting as, the scope, purpose, any technical or organizational security measures. And then finally, those placeholders that we had in there, such as the 2 controls that we're working with, any clauses, related processes, any tasks that have been assigned, and then finally a list of the assets that are being used within this process as well. So we're going to close out of here, and we're going to move on now into the data flow map itself. Like I mentioned, this is one that we have created before. The reason we do that is just so you can get an idea straight away of what a basic skeleton of what the map is going to look like, but we do run you through every single point in this process map and explain on how we actually built it in the first place. So at the top right hand corner, we have our help button. This is just an area where you can download the manual if you needed to, like so. Any new process map that you are creating, this will automatically be prompted to you, but it won't be a nuisance. It won't keep doing it every time you're going into a pre-existing map. Close out of here. You'll then have 2 options at the top here to view the report live inside the portal. It doesn't require you to save, refresh, or log in and log out for the report to be correct. It'll automatically pull that information from the process map that you've created. then if you wish to, you can export it into a Word document, and the purpose of that is you may want to make small modifications to maybe a header type or even company logos, or adding your own record or reference numbers as well. These middle four here are what we're essentially going to be using today, or what you would also be using to build and work upon your process map. We have a comment tool at the top here. Now, something to note, comments are only referenced in the number of them attached to a particular asset or transfer. They are not displayed in any way when it comes to your reports. If we select on the comment tool, we can select an individual asset and leave a comment if we want to maybe another colleague of ours. We can also do that when it comes to transfers as well. Clicking on the add comment, it gives you the free text box, and again, that same area where you can upload a file to if you wanted to. The next tab along here is our connection tool. Now, just to quickly illustrate this, what you would do is if you had two assets that weren't joined originally, you simply hover over the first one. It will give you this orange spot that you should be able to make out on my screen, and then you click on that once, and then you release and then click on the asset you want to join to with that same orange button. It creates that line. Once you've then started populating the map with data items, that's then why you can start seeing these numbers traveling along these transfers. The next option on here is a move tool. You'll use this at the very beginning to obviously build the backbone to what your process is going to be looking like. Alternatively, it can also be used later on down the line if you wanted to manipulate the map into a different configuration, maybe to free up a bit of space for another asset to be added if the process has evolved or grown upon. And again, that's something that we mentioned at the beginning as well. So we'll put that back in place. You may have also noticed that everything stays intact. All the data items remain on their transfer types, and also that the name of the asset will always clip over the top of a transfer to make sure that's the most prominent information available to you. The next one along is a hand tool. This just gets rid of the need to have side and bottom scroll bars, so it allows you to pan the canvas just by clicking and dragging your screen like so, but it also doubles up as essentially the selection tool for your process. So we can select on individual assets, and it opens up right-hand side attributes panels, which we'll go through these in a bit more detail. So you can select on assets, you can select on transfers, and you can also select on inputs to your process as well. These last six over here should be relatively straightforward to you. So we've got zoom in and zoom out. We've got remove and duplicate. So these two will work by simply selecting on an individual asset, removing or choosing to duplicate it to make it easier when you're creating larger maps that use the same asset time and time again. And then finally, we've got undo and redo to try and cover off some of those small errors you might be making either when you're first using the tool or even if when you're further advanced. If the map's just large and you need to undo a quick change, you can do that straight away. The memory on there, we believe, is up to 6, so it should cover off quite a few changes. Over here on the left-hand side, now this is your asset library, which you would have either configured at the very beginning, like we showed you earlier on with regards to the organization assets. Alternatively, and of some of the early adopters to the software, this is ultimately where you would have created your asset library at the very beginning. So all you'd need to do here is select Add New Asset. We can then choose what the asset type is going to be, and then once it's on this screen, so we're just going to choose archive, for example. Clicking it once populates the screen. Using the hand tool, we then click on there and then give it its relevant information, what it's going to be seen as, where it's located, if there's any data encryption, or if the data is encrypted on here, the asset type, and then obviously the reference as well. And again, anything you do within this process map is a global change and will be remembered for future use as well. So we'll cancel out of here, just select on here. I'm just going to remove that as we don't want too many additional unwanted items on the screen. The next tab along, or the next option down, is going to be the ability to add a data input. So you can see that we've created one here already. Again, it works in the same way as before. Click it once and it pops it onto the next available space on the canvas. If you want to put it somewhere a bit more specific, you can just drag and drop. If you're working with larger maps, that can be quite handy sometimes as well. So you'll notice that each one of these is blank. You can, once you've selected on the individual input, once you've created that connection, give it its name. Obviously, we've just given out something basic like customer. Now, some of you might have noticed at the top of the screen, there is a big orange bar, and that just periodically pops up just to remind the user to save their work. With it not being a local locally used piece of software is reliant on an internet connection. So if you are working on site with a customer, or maybe outside of your normal working environment, where the Wi-Fi might be a bit shaky, or if you're on a guest Wi-Fi, it is always recommended to save your changes, as if you don't and you do lose or drop a connection, you may lose some of the work up until that point. So we're just going to select not now because we're already working on a pre-existing app anyway. So we're just going to select on these. Again, we don't want too many data inputs, just to complicate the process map for this afternoon. Now, on the note of data inputs, we've only got one illustrated on here. There's no reason why you can't have more than one. You could have 2, 3, 4, or 5 connecting to the same asset. The example that I commonly use is you could have a front desk to a business that could have 5 different data inputs: phone, email, fax, and so on. And each one of them will need to illustrate those different transfer methods in which the information joined your business. The next tab along, or the next option along on here, is the ability to add a data subject. Now, we've seen this being used in 2 ways. Essentially, the tool is actually built to use the data subject to show the return of data going to an individual. We have found that some people are using it as the go-between or a stopgap between the data input and the first asset, just to be a bit more specific on the exact location as to where that particular data input is and where they are based. So the next option down here is then going to be your search box. Again, this just helps you quickly navigate through your asset library. And then finally, underneath there, you'll have a grey area, which will show the pre-existing assets being used within the process. And then just below there in the dark black area, you'll then have an area where the rest of your library is going to reside. And obviously, you can always go back to that or scroll through that if you needed to at a later point as well. So we'll collapse out of here, and we're now going to go through how we built our process map. So we've already covered off how you actually build the process. So using anything in your library or anything that you'd have created from scratch, you simply click them once like so, and it populates the screen like so. We're just going to select on here and remove it. So that is essentially how we got the assets onto the screen. And then also we showed you how you created the connections as well, just by selecting each point on here. So now that we've gone through, just to give you a breakdown as to what our assets are and where they are located and what they're going to be doing. These middle 3 here, they are all based within the UK. So our sales site is hosted in the UK, our billing team is in the UK, and our service centre inbox is also in the UK. Our sales fulfillment team, they are based in France, as well as our distributor, and that's just so that when we come to our report, we can illustrate cross-border processing. And then finally, these last 2 points here, the internal SharePoint, that's using our custom location, which was the Microsoft Azure one that we saw earlier in Ireland. And then over here, we have our company server, which is based in the Bahamas. It was picked purely at random, but mainly because it was outside the EA. This way we can show you some additional areas that you need to populate when it comes to transferring data to a third country. So now we've got it clear as to where our assets are located, we now need to start illustrating the information we're going to be receiving, the lawful basis we're taking that information on, if there's any exceptions, and also who the data subjects are in this case. So we're going to select on this first connection. So if you could imagine, this is blank. Over here on the right hand side, by clicking on it, you will be asked to choose the data source. Now in some businesses, it might be that you're pulling information from an external company, another site, maybe a server. It could be a continuation of another process. So this is just how you can outline, maybe it's other. You can then outline what the other data source is and then its reference as well. We're going to stick with data subject, and we're just going to leave the reference as something very simple as customer. We're then going to outline the method in which that information joins our business. Now, a very rudimental way of explaining an online transaction is the data has come to us via internet. If you want to be a bit more specific, the list itself is relatively comprehensive, should cover anything you need. But again, there's other at the bottom here where you can outline what the other method is going to be. So we'll go back to internet. The next option down here is then the data items in which you are going to be handling. So we've already gone through and chosen ours, but just to explain how we come to this, at the top here, you need to choose what your lawful basis is going to be. Now, obviously, some of these are just placeholders. We do flit it between which contractual base, lawful basis we deal with. For new users, you may want to use the I button. It gives you a description as to each one of the, or essentially the article, and then a description as to the different types of lawful basis. So whether it's consent, contractual, necessity, legitimate interest, and so on. So we can change that at the top there. Below there, you'll then have exception. The I box next to there is exactly the same. It will give you that same walkthrough as the processing of sensitive data items. What you will notice though is that it has been grayed out. It's to stop end users picking this by mistake when you're only dealing with personal data items. So moving on to the data items. The first section you'll see is going to be your typical personal items such as address, credit card numbers, etc. Below there at the very bottom you'll have other, and then you can outline some more specific items, so maybe a shipping address, billing address. If we're going back to the late 90s, we're still shipping out CD software, so we're going to take that information. And then in the last section at the bottom here, you'll then have the sensitive data items. Now, obviously, we're not going to be taking things like biometric data for an online transaction. If we were, for whatever reason, by selecting on there, you'll then see exception is highlighted, and we can go through and mark off what the exception is. So whether it's explicit content, employment law, public health, etc., etc. So we're going to leave this unticked. Over here on the right-hand side, this is where you're going to drill down to be a bit more specific onto who or what your data subject is. So we're just going to choose customers at this point. The list itself, again, is relatively comprehensive. However, at the bottom here, there is other. Now, for one of the more frequently asked questions we do get is regarding data items and data subjects. Just to make you all aware, it is an area that we are working on. It is a little bit more difficult than we thought to actually integrate it properly. It's more to deal with the older more pre-existing users of the tool that have already gone through and populated process maps. So it's a bit more complex in the background than we first anticipated, but it is something we're looking to expand upon in the near future. That's unfortunately as much as I can really go into with regards to that. So we're going to select OK on here. The next option is, again, we can add comments. Now, comments don't show up on the reports, as I may have already mentioned, and this is just in addition to using the comment tool at the very top here as well. So we'll hide our comments, and then lastly, we can choose whether our data is encrypted. Now, as a very basic option, we've selected yes. HTTPS is the protocol in which most users would be going through when they're either logging into a website or when they're making a payment online as well. So we're going to select apply. What you'll just see is the data input names itself to be a customer, and then the data items transfer across. Now, to the eagle-eyed viewer, you may have noticed between customer and customer sales website that the line is in fact dotted. That is purely just to give you a very top-level key indicator that that's new data that's entering into a process map. Any existing data handled between the assets after the data input section will then be a grey solid line, just showing the directional flow of that information throughout your business. So now that we've shown these 7 data items transferring across onto our company sales website, we're just going to show you what it would look like moving throughout the rest of the process map. So selecting on this next transfer, so this is going through our company sales website. That's going to handle the overall transaction, so to speak, and then it's going to go through a billing team. They're going to ensure that the payment has been taken successfully, be that via credit card, payment, PayPal, etc., and then they pass it on to a service center. So at this point, we need to illustrate how has that information moved from the sales website and how has it then reached the billing team. We're going to say it's an automated system, so it'd be like a back-end system that a billing team may be able to access. So we're just going to call it maybe system to system as a very basic option. Again, if you do use something that's a bit more high-tech than my choice of methods, then obviously choose other, and you can stipulate what other is going to be. Below there, you'll then need to choose which data items are going to continue through the rest of the map. Now, at this point, we're showing that yes, we need to show that all this information is moving across. If you decide at this point to say that no email address doesn't get transferred to the billing team, because of the way that we've structured our data map, if that doesn't transfer to the billing team, it therefore drops off at that point and it will no longer be available to you throughout the process map. So just be aware of that when choosing what data items and which branches you're going to be shown on your processes. So we're choosing that yes, all of them are going to move across. Select OK, and again, on every single transfer, it's not just new data inputs. You can show if there's any encryption being used at that point as well. So we'll select OK on here. So just to go through the rest of this little section, those same 7 items, once they've been confirmed from the billing team, will then go into a service center. You may want to add another offshoot from here to say if it has been declined, you'll then show that going to maybe another mailbox, which then sends a message to the end user saying essentially your transaction has failed. So that could be another branch moving off of there. So now that all these 7 data items have hit our service center, it has 3 prongs in which it's going to move off to. Now, we've shown that only 5 of those data items are being sent to our sales fulfillment team in France. The reason for that is they don't at this point now need to know the credit card details, and there's also a couple of other information pieces that they don't need. So we're going to show the service center inbox is emailing that information to our sales team, and we're saying that they only actually need the address, email address, name, phone number, and shipping address and billing address. For people that are familiar with companies like DPD, DHL, just to name a few, they now have either ways of emailing you updates on the status of your delivery, or even some of them do text messages as well, with a link to take you to their site to give you a more in-depth, maybe a place in the queue, etc. So we'll select OK on here. And again, we've got the data encryption if we need to as well, and hit apply. So because we've now only sent those 5 data items to our sales fulfillment team, those same 5 items can then only be sent over to the distributor, and then obviously the product is then sent out to the end user. So obviously this isn't by anywhere near the end of our process map. It could keep going and going and growing over time. But essentially it's just to give you the basics as to the starting point of a process for sales, for example. So that is prong number 1 that's been dealt with. So the fulfillment team, distributor sends the information off. The next one it's going to move over to is our company servers. That's essentially where we store or host all of our private data. So be that maybe it's a backup of information, maybe it's just simply a shared area that everyone can get to. Obviously, everyone's used to shared drives and File Explorer. That's essentially what this is going to be used as in this case. So on here, now, as we mentioned, because our service center is based in the UK and our company server is based within the Bahamas, there has to be additional information added onto this transfer here. So clicking on here, we are saying that yes, all 7 of these data items need to be sent over, as it is going to be a backup file. We can then see at the top here that yes, the method is backup. It's not just simply a transfer to our server. We're then going to say yes, all of our items need to move across. Any comments that need to be added, if there's any data encryption on this particular transfer, we have left it blank, but obviously more commonly than not in most businesses, even the transfer may be encrypted depending on the types of data you're dealing with. And then finally at the bottom here, this is something I was wanting to illustrate by showing you cross-border, outside EEA transfers or third country transfers. If this is left as unknown, we'll just hit apply just to show you as an example. It will highlight this line in bright red to obviously draw your attention to it, and there will be an exclamation point on there again just to make you aware that there is additional context or information that has to be populated to ensure you're compliant. So we'll select on this transfer again. So all you need to do here is, if you want a refresher, click the I button, and we've got this information here. And then below there, you've got your appropriate safeguards in place, and then you can choose the safeguard, or if derogations apply, you can then choose from this list below as well. So we're going to choose something nice and simple. Appropriate safeguards are in place and standard data protection clauses. Once we click apply on here, it then just moves the line back to what it should look like ordinarily. And then this last prong here is just sending 4 of the basic elements of the data we've taken to an internal SharePoint system, where this then might branch off into maybe a more of a marketing or digital marketing process where you can illustrate only these pieces of information are being used. So with that showing the transfers, what we're now going to have a quick look at is going to be the assets themselves. So how or what or where they're stored, and what records they're going to be holding, etc., etc. Now, the one that we primarily focus on is going to be our company servers. That's more commonly where you would find records to be stored on a more long-term basis. Obviously, earlier aspects of or earlier points in the process map will equally hold them, but the company server is the more commonly used one that we found in processes. So at the top here, we've got our asset being illustrated or displayed as a server. Now, this isn't going to be strictly correct, but we can change it if we want to maybe local storage, maybe it's a cloud or web-based applications. You can always modify this, but again, we do need to make it very, very clear whatever change you make here is a global change, and it will impact the rest of your process maps previously and moving forward. So please be careful when choosing this. If you do need to create another server that is going to be illustrated slightly differently and named differently, just create a new asset. There's no limit to the number that you can create, and that way it doesn't cause conflicts when dealing with the records on them as well. So at the top here, we're going to change this to now be a local storage. Below there, we'll then have its reference, a company server. We're going to leave that as, or we could change it to be company server private, for example, again, just to show you how the modification will affect the library moving forward. Below there, you'll then have any records that are being stored on here. So we're going to just call this one something very simple like online sales transactions. Some of you may have found that you cannot remove a record from an asset. It is deliberate. Essentially, regardless of what the process is, that record is still going to be stored within the asset being used. So it is still going to be held within that part of the business. If you don't want that to be illustrated, there's two ways you can mitigate that. You either create almost a duplicate of that said asset, however, make a small change to it just so you can differentiate from a top level. Alternatively, export the report into a Word document and remove the record manually like that, just so you don't overcomplicate certain processes. With all that said and done, there's no limit to the number of records that you can add to a particular asset. So at the top here, we can select add a new one. We're not going to do that, otherwise we'd end up with quite a few on here from the demos that we do. We're going to simply edit the one that already pre-exists. The screen that you're looking at now looks exactly the same as what it would do as if you were creating a new one anyway. So at the top here, you'll then have the name of the record. So we're calling ours online sales transactions. We can change this name at a later point if we want to. If the record does change its, maybe you have a certain keyword that you use internally, that can always be changed as well. Sorry, excuse me. You'll then have your classification fields. So at the very beginning, where I showed you that the four that are built in, confidential, private, public, and restricted, they are all there as standard. And then we have our more customized areas such as sensitive and highly restrictive. If you had chosen to toggle them on or off or delete them entirely, they would also be removed from this section, just so you don't have users of your portal using them by mistake. Below there, we have the format in which information is stored in. Now, with this being a server, obviously it's going to be digital text. However, if you are using things like filing systems in HR for maybe scanned documents or personal records or person effects as such, you will then need to obviously mark that as physical text, image, and so on and so forth. Below there is your retention period. Now, at the moment, we set ours to be unknown. The reason we do that is just so we can illustrate the report picking up on undefined retention periods. Ordinarily, you would need to pick days, weeks, months, and years, and then over here, choose from the drop down as to the number of each one of those that it is. The last box on here is who the recipient of that information is going to be, or what the recipient is. By that, I mean anybody that is now going to come into contact with that information, or is simply is potentially going to receive information from this record. Now, we've got a simple placeholder here as IT manager. With them being the admin of this particular asset, they're more than likely going to come into contact with it. But the recipient section on here, it's not mandatory, so you can at least create the record for now and then come back in and modify that at a later point, as well as also the retention periods. As you can see, we are editing this one right now anyway. So we'll cancel out of here, or we'd select OK, and then that would store that, as you can see on screen. You'll then be able to change its location if you wanted to. We're going to leave it as is, purely just so that our report can pick up on that cross-border processing or that third country transfer. What the asset is going to be seen as, whether it's a controller, processor, etc. Any comments, again, comments don't show up. They simply show the number of comments, not what the comment mentions. And then finally below there, if there's any data encryption on that particular asset. So we've chosen yes, and the very common one is something like BitLocker, maybe on a server or even on local machines that you might be using. So we'll hit apply on there. And that essentially is the process map. Now, for some of you that have been on the demos before, it is quite reminiscent. It's essentially a carbon copy of what we've been through before. We just wanted to cover off some of the additional Article 30 steps that you would need to either readdress from pre-existing processes or make sure they are compiled when creating new ones moving on. So now that we've created all this information, we're going to go through and view the report. Now, the report itself, we have, it's going to look ever so slightly condensed. That's purely because we're viewing it live inside the tool. When you export it into a Word document or even into a PDF document, it does scale to A4 PDF. So please bear that in mind when viewing this on the screen. So now we're going to start coming into a lot more of the information that we mentioned earlier, again, more to do with the Article 30 information that we have recently updated into the tool. So at the top here, it just gives you an outline as to the reason why you're even doing what we're doing. It will then give you the contact details. So we can see here that John Smith acts as a processor for the process described in this report. So the processor, name and contact details, then name, Vigilant, demo Gary, and that's essentially the portal that I'm logged into. So we can modify this for you at a later point. I don't believe it's something you can do yourself. So if you do need that change in, maybe you're either bought by a different company or you've bought a different company and you need to amend this, then do let us know. Below there, you'll then have the controller's name and contact details. So the controller is John Smith, email address, phone number. Obviously, appreciate this is all just placeholder information. And then finally, the representative. So who is your DPO, for example, and so on. So I've just put myself in here, my email, phone number, address, and so on. Below here, you'll then have the process overview. So this is going to be the name of the process, the owner, so that is the essentially the company or the group. In my case, it's Vigilant Demo. Yours will be your company name. You'll then have the scope statement, the purpose of processing, and the technical and organizational security measures that you're putting into place. So again, we just put in here PCI controls in place when taking payments. You will need to be a bit more descriptive than that. Again, it's more just there to fill up the space to show you what it would look like when you run the reports. The next section along here will be your summary. So this is just going to give you a snapshot as to what sort of details you're handling, where they are, if you do have any cross-border processing. And these two at the bottom here, they're automatic. You don't need to tell the system to do this. As you've seen, I've not had to save or refresh anything. And it automatically picks up that there is cross-border processing, and then it does include transfers to locations outside of the EEA. It will automatically at this point also pick up if there's sensitive items, and although we are only using one type of lawful basis at the moment, if you were using multiples, it would add those to the bullet points there as well. Below there, you'll have your map. Now, our map is quite small and does scale quite well, and I'm ever so sorry, but I did miss that off. Obviously, we did make the change, so it is now automatically picked up that company server private is on there with the new logo that we've modified this to be a local storage icon as opposed to a server icon. Ever so sorry for missing that off. And I'm not sure if you can make it out, but in the background, it's also changed in the library as well. Coming back to the map that we're looking on screen, it does scale relatively well. If you are working with large amounts, what we would suggest doing is exporting into a Word document. The file itself or the actual snapshot you see is just simply an image file. It can be moved and then manipulated to be on a larger scale if you need it for maybe printed onto an A3 form and keeping it up on a wall in an office, for example. The next section, 1.3, is your personal data inventory. So at the top here under your summary, it's going to let you know if you're dealing with any sensitive data items, and then finally going through the types of lawful basis that you're dealing with. So for us, all 7 of ours are legitimate interests. Then it will list down the data items, the data subjects, lawful basis, and if there's any exceptions. The way that this would filter this through, it would be done based on data subjects and then lawful basis, therefore therefore ensuring that you don't end up with the email address all bunched together with the different types of legitimate interests. You want it based on the subjects and the lawful basis. The next section on here is the data subject. So as I mentioned earlier, there's 2 methods in which we've seen people use this. This is simply just going to, or essentially read it out. It's a data subject is an actual person who can be identified directly and or indirectly by reference to an identifier or factors specific to that person. So all the information that is going to be displayed here is the reference to what the data subject is or who the subject is, their location, and any comments. Now again, comments aren't going to be displayed here. This is purely just as a bubble that you can see down here on the right hand side. Section 1.5 is going to be your asset register. So this is just going to keep track of all the assets being used in your process. And as you might have noticed, underneath each one of these larger headers, it gives you a description as to what an asset register is, what a record is, and so on. You'll then have the summary. So we can see that none of the identified assets are operated by a processor, which is correct. They're either a third party or a controller within our business. And then we'll have the 6 identified assets are located within the EEA, with only one of them being outside of that location. Below there, you'll then have the name and asset type. You'll then have its location along with its status, what it's going to be operating as, what the encryption type is. So yes, it's BitLocker on our company server private, and then we've got any records and any comments. The comments, again, these will only show 1, 2, 3, or 4, depending on the number of comments, not the comment itself. And an easy way to tidy this up is just remove the column that is on there if you don't want it to be populated. What you might notice is the hazard symbols next to each one of the operator types, and that's purely because we are seen as a processor in this particular case, and these are seen as controllers or third parties, so essentially we're not in control of that particular asset. The next point on here is going to be our record. So our record list is relatively small. Obviously yours over time will become quite large, especially if you're using the same assets and just keep adding more and more records to them. So at the top here, we can see obviously that description as to what a record is. We can then see that all of our records in this case actually have an undefined retention period. That isn't normal. You may have maybe 10, 15 records, only 2 of which you need to follow up with the relevant stakeholder to find out what information or how long they store it for. So it would say you have only 2 or 3 with undefined retention periods. Below there, you'll then have the classification of all records as sensitive, and again that will be broken down into individual bullet points if you were choosing sensitive, public, etc. The next tab along here, in fact the final tab before we go into the questions, is the transfers 1.7. So whilst we do have that nice pretty top level chart that you can see in the background that we've created, this will just essentially go through in a very wordy text letting you know the methods in which you're moving the data in between transfers, the data sources, whether it's a subject or other, and then it will stipulate what other is, the data items that are moving along an individual transfer. So as you saw earlier, some of these do get smaller. So from the service center to the fulfillment team, obviously it picks up on that, where they're coming from and where they're going to. These are obviously a bit ill formatted for now, but when you do export it, they should scale correctly. We'll then have the encryption type. So yes, HTTPS, we've only got one encryption toggled on as an example. Any third country transfer information. So if you recall back the transfer to the Bahamas, with that being a third country, we did have to outline that there are safeguards in place, and then finding that comments column, which can be removed as well. So that is the data flow mapping tool and essentially the training webinar section covered. Now we are going to leave it up on screen just in case we do need to refer back to it. We do have some additional slides to cover off, and then once we've finished this, we'll then go through any of the questions you may have. So just to confirm, we've gone through the setup, so the login to Cider Comply, navigate to the data mapping tool, clicking the button on the home page to then take you into the business processes you want to map. So we've gone through, created a process. This is obviously where we'd ordinarily go through and to cover these off, such as the final outcome, which was the report, and then finally our Q&A section. And we'll just pop this up on screen just so it's there as a placeholder whilst we're doing the questions.